Can you hear me properly? Not yet.
Yes.
Yes?
I think so.
Good. Otherwise I can shout in that kind of size.
No, but there's also, yeah, this is what I forgot actually. There's also probably about 50 people online that are listening to us. And we are streaming this and are planning to put this online after the conference. So in case anybody has any objections to that, please notify me about that, and then we will make sure that that we cut you out, so to say. Thank you. Okay, Annette, you have the floor.
So it's good morning, and thank you very much for inviting me to this event. I think that some of you, as we've seen in the pictures, already participated at yesterday's excursions and started looking into what you called visions. And I think that the whole concept, or the name of this conference, Vision, is really very much in line with what we are trying to do under a research and innovation mission called It's Soil Deal for Europe. The name is no coincidence. You've certainly heard about the EU Green Deal, which is the current umbrella for EU policies. And so we really want to make a statement saying that this research program is part of the Green Deal. And as you will see later, it's really essential to many of the EU Green Deal policies. I just want to know, before I get into more detail, to a bit of map where you are, who of you are soil scientists or really working on a day-to-day basis on land and soil management? Okay, so these half it. And who of you have heard already about the Soil Deal mission? Oh, okay, fantastic. This is more than the usual audience. So I will probably not go into so much detail because you're very well informed, it seems. Still, what I think is important to understand is you've certainly known from what I can sense the research activities on land soil management. Missions are new instruments just introduced in Horizon Europe. And the formal definition is this is a portfolio of actions across disciplines, and then of course across sectors, to achieve bold, inspirational, measurable goals within a set time frame. We have a set time frame 2030. And out of this discussions that we had, we introduced 5 missions on climate adaptation, cancer, climate neutral and smart cities, ocean and waters, and soil. The area was called soil health. We actually like to think that the soil mission is at the center of all of those, because you need healthy soils, you know, for climate neutral cities that are green, for landscapes that are resilient to climate stress, for clean waters, and of course to have healthy food to prevent diseases. So this is kind of our center of gravity in a sense. And I would like also to frame missions in another way, which is very much what I think you have been discussing, or you will be discussing these 2 days, is to me, missions are a way to connect the ways normally scientists think, you know, there's a certain rationale, mindset, and curiosity to better understand the world. And the typical thing that we see in discussions is, how can we better understand processes, let's say, of land degradation? How can we improve our modeling capacities? This is the kind of thinking we have in science. Then people's needs and aspirations are connected, but still differently framed. And people are really concerned about what is the food I can get for, where is it? And is it sufficient and healthy to have a healthy environment? Can my kids play on a healthy, clean land? So how to connect these 2 ways of dealing with the same issue? It's not so easy, not so trivial. And we've seen in the European Innovation Partnership, AGRI, the EIP AGRI, where we connect scientists with farmers, for example, and advisors and other stakeholders, that it takes a lot of time, and we need to invest in this time, to translate farmers' needs, what they really want to know, into a scientific question, and vice versa, how to explain results from science to practitioners. How can we use that? So this is in a way what we want to achieve. The time is, I think, absolutely right and great, because probably, I wouldn't like to say 10 years, but 10 to 15 years ago, you would really need to explain why you're working on soils and why this is all important. And I really like this graph where somebody said, oh, this is the elephant in the room. We all depend on soils, nobody's talking about it. But this has changed. If you see at the level of conferences, publications, and even widely streamed movies, soils are really in the limelight. So that is fantastic. This is good news in the sense that we have now, I think, a very supportive environment for acting. At EU level, at least, we have a policy framework. Within the EU Green Deal, we have the new EU soil strategy. Some of you are working on the upcoming soil health law, which is related to the strategy. So this is supposed to be legal framework to manage, to regulate the management of soils. Then we have an expanding soil monitoring in Europe with a newly created EU Soil Observatory, EUSO, that builds on Lucas. And then we have the mission, that is really a research innovation program and more to really make some of these things happen. So I would say this is not too bad, and let's see how to capitalize on all these three instruments. I should probably say also that the missions, while being based on the Horizon Europe budget, are asked to mobilize other sources. So they are supposed to have like spin-offs on other policies, encourage actions in other programs. So we won't be hopefully limited to our budget in Horizon Europe, but be able to tap into, let's say, encourage more actions under LIFE or under structural funds, Interreg, or we have done already mobilize under the PRIMA Mediterranean Initiative specific calls on soils. So that kind of a knock-on effects is something we really want to achieve. I'll come back to this later. So the starting point to really for the mission, I think is important also in the sense that, well, I don't need to explain here why healthy soils are important and all the ecosystems functions that depend on healthy soils and the soil functions. This was the big, let's say, basis. We need healthy soils. Then there was an analysis undertaken by the mission board that developed the mission and the Joint Research Center that came to the conclusion through a sort of very simple, crude method. It's not a detailed analysis, but at a broader picture, they said 2/3 of our soils are not healthy. It means they're not able to provide us with all the ecosystem services they should normally do. This is quite a statement if you think about that 2/3 are not able to provide all the functions in one way or another. The mission board, actually, I should say, so the exercise of developing the mission took 2 years, with 1 year work by mission board headed by Kees Veerman, who was agriculture minister in the Netherlands a while ago, and I think he's also associated to Wageningen University. The vice chair was Teresa Pinto Correa, and there were 13 others, not only scientists. They had a very ambitious view. They said, if 2/3 are not healthy, why don't have as a goal to have 2/3 healthy by 2030? That was the initial goal. We stepped down a bit from this due to, you will see, obvious reasons on how to measure all this. Now, the other basis was, the other recognition was that we do have already a lot of knowledge. Not sufficient, but we have a lot. But already this knowledge, how can we translate that into practice? That would be a big step forward. The other gap we saw, or the mission board saw, is most of the work is done on agricultural soils, also the monitoring work. And policies like the Common Agricultural Policy obviously focus on soils in agriculture. So how can we go beyond that and tackle urban soils, forest soils, and even natural soils that are more and more degraded? So I said already, in that overall context, we saw the shift to various policies addressing soil health. And we did a bit of a mapping of solutions. You know, we did a community call asking people, from your experiments, try and identify the scale of improvements you could provide us with. And we saw that really radical change is needed and possible if we apply many of the solutions. So this was the starting point for the vision. And before I come exactly to the vision, let me highlight that the EU Green Deal already has embedded many, many targets that will not be able to be met if we don't have fully functional soils. If you just think of targets on nutrient use, fertilizer, the reduction of pesticides, reduction of microplastics, all these require that you have soils that, for example, we just saw, can capture water, can cycle nutrients in better ways, have high organic matter, huge biodiversity. So that is the basis for dealing with low input systems. By 2035, there's a strong demand to be climate neutral in land use, forestry, agriculture sectors, and the EU has set out to become climate neutral by 2050. All this is really something that we could not do if we don't look into soil health. And this is why the mission is part of all these strategies that you see here listed. In one way or another, the mission is mentioned as a mechanism to speed up innovations. So that's quite a commitment. Now, let's say, what is the vision? We stepped away from saying exactly so much percentage of the soil should be healthy because we don't have the baseline and we are not sure we can measure exactly the improvements. So we set out to build 100 living labs and lighthouses, but this is not the real goal. It's more to lead a transition, so to create a pathway towards healthy soils by 2030. And for this, we specified a number of objectives. Most of you know them. They are address some of the soil threats and soil properties, and two are more cross-cutting. So desertification, carbon stocks, sealing, soil pollution, erosion, soil biodiversity. And the cross-cutting ones are how can we really, through our production and consumption patterns, reduce our footprint elsewhere? And how can we improve soil literacy in society? In all of these objectives has some quantified targets, indicators, and relate to all land uses beyond agriculture. I gave a presentation last week, and I saw that one of the parallel sessions today is about erosion. So this is just to show you how these objectives are backed by sort of a baseline, a target, and indicators, a proposal for indicators. We have set out a set of indicators that are not perfect, but it's a start to measure soil health. And I've seen, we just discussed this morning, the huge efforts going on to measure, to identify indicators for soil health in a legally binding context. So that could be a start. For organic carbon stocks related to climate, as well, just some example. And we have taken the targets from existing commitments. We did not invent new targets. It's all the commitments we have already signed or endorsed in European or even global context, through SDGs, for example, or the 4 per mille initiative. Now, how we want to implement this? You know, when you have a program, you need to cluster that in various little parts. So we said the first building program is, of course, we need, even if we have already a lot, we need more knowledge. We need data to process the data. We have to improve that access. We have data repositories, technologies. We've just heard an example from China. So to develop all this, we have, as we should do in the research program, calls for increasing our knowledge and tools. Now, the core of the whole issue is, how do we translate this into practice? And for this, we have a building block called Living Labs and Lighthouses, where we want to create an extensive network of real-world real-world sites, you know, where researchers and the land managers and others in the value chain, for example, can work together. All this, of course, needs to be complemented with solid monitoring, soil monitoring. We still see that EU soil monitoring is not harmonized in the EU, it's not complete, and absolutely needs improvement. And then we want to increase, as I said, soil literacy and communication on what the mission is doing and try to engage with people. I don't know if you can see all of this. No, it's a bit cut, but all of these building blocks are not just related to let's say, initiating actions only on soils, but really we want to address the drivers of soil health. Just to give an example, on soil pollution, one thing is to work on soils to reduce the pollution, but the other one is prevention. How can we prevent that microplastics get already into soils, so go up the value chain and work there? So this is also covered here. And then we really want to make huge efforts to combine the, I would say, the group of people acting on soil health by bringing together researchers, land managers, regional stakeholders, citizens, and international partners. So normally when we start talking about living labs, there are many, many unknowns. We do have existing ones, but the mission board and also colleagues developed the concept further, and we would like to apply a harmonized approach to all the living labs funded under the mission. For this, we've created some criteria that are in the implementation plan. What is important to highlight is the following. A living lab is not one site, let's say one farm, but actually a cluster of sites. In the area of agriculture, for example, it would be 5 to 15, 20 farmers working together in a certain region or sub-region. And that's the beauty of this is what gets interesting, is that by this, you're able to work at various levels, from plot to farm to landscape level. And if you look at nature-based solutions, this is actually the level you want to reach. We cannot work really on nature-based solutions unless you go to landscape level. And many of the solutions are not enough. It's not enough if we deal with them on the farm itself. So when we talk about a project of living labs, that would include 4 to 5 living labs. And for this, we have also developed a set of criteria. I will visualize this because this is where we always get people not understanding what we want. So just graphically, this would be a living lab with, let's say, in the area of agriculture, many farms. And then in a EU project to which you can apply would bring together 4 to 5 labs. So this is a bit, it will be a challenge, I tell you, to implement this. We are going to launch the first call for living labs in the 23 work program of Horizon Europe. And we are going to engage with many, many stakeholders to further explain the concept so that we can get really exciting applications. I'm spreading this now to you so that you can already start thinking. Something else I would like to highlight is, so this was the living labs. Lighthouses are places where you then showcase the good practices that have come out of living labs. And there's no particular definition. It's really up to you to identify, this is my lighthouse that came up of my project. And we will establish, of course, this bit by bit, starting with a very modest call, establishing 4 to 5 living labs, and then gradually building up to 100 by 2030. The big challenge will be to go beyond agriculture, to identify living labs in forests, in, let's say, in cities and urban areas, where we don't have yet the community as we have in agriculture. But I hope that you can also spread the gospel and try and think about how we can address soil pollution, for example, in an urban context through living labs, or in forests, where we still have a lot to do. Now, this is a bit dry. I will not go into detail, but so building all this, as I said, it took 2 years from the first ideas how can we do a mission on soil health, to having it launched last year in October. And since then, we have also started building structures to engage with stakeholders, structures for improve the soil monitoring with the Joint Research Center. And we are going to publish a call so that we can establish a body that will coordinate all the living labs. This is something very important that we cannot do alone. And then we started already launching research topics in 21. You have certainly seen the current 22 work program that's open for proposals, and you have time until September to do so. I will just show the topics. And then we're working on 23, where we will launch the first living labs. Now, another very important task that you don't see, it's really behind the scenes, is I just mentioned that we need to get out from research purely and establish our vision in other policies and other programs. So in relation to the Common Agricultural Policy, for example, we have been talking with member states. Talking is not the right word. We have provided our recommendations to their strategic plans on how to make better use of soil improving measures and to link up with the objectives of the mission. And this is really important for the member states, that they have these, I would say, this kind of wording and that they foresee these actions in the strategic plans to allocate the funding under the Common Agricultural Policy. So potentially this will have a huge impact. And we are also looking to other programs to make the links. We're also talking to philanthropic institutions and how they can join us, and we can do common projects. And then we have done really so much communication and engagement. I will show you in a minute. This is just the overview of the open topics, where you can maybe find something for you on soil biodiversity or decontamination, soil carbon issues, soil education. I will have the link later in the last slides. Last thing I'd like to highlight is soil are not just a European concern, it's really a global concern. We have many commitments at international level with the Global Soil Partnership. All topics, in principle, are open for international collaboration, even if not all partners can be funded. But we've seen a huge interest, and we have now specific bilaterals with Australia, the US, Canada. We have a dialogue with Africa and China, and they're really all interested in having joint activities, joint research, innovation. So this will come peu à peu. The first topic, the first initiative that is starting on this is a project called ORCASA. Some of you know the previous CIRCASA gave rise to the ORCASA network that is trying to create a international consortium on soil carbon sequestration. And from there onwards, we hope to see many more international collaborations spilling up. Let me just highlight, so if you go to our websites, you will find a bit of many documents, of course, but then also some tools or packs where you can also try and interact with various audiences if you go beyond academia. We've enjoyed it very, very much, actually trying to explain why we do what we do to a non-specialized audience. And we had amazing experiences with children, with, let's say, adults that just wants to know more by having games and really explaining in a very tangible way the importance of soils. So if you have a look at it, I think you can find some useful tools. So let me just finalize. I would like to highlight, so you find here the Soil Deal web page. The implementation plan is where you find all the details how we want to move on forward between now and 27. And the last bullet point is where you find the open calls with the research topics. So with this, I would really like to encourage you not just to participate in a research project, a research consortium, but spread the gospel about the mission, about various activities on education, on importance of soils, and maybe also inspire other institutions and only yours to take part in this adventure. Thank you so much.
Okay, it's also working? No, no. It is, okay. Excellent, so we have time for just one or two clarification questions from the audience. Not, then we are going to continue. Oh, there is. But then, wait. Otherwise, the online people cannot hear it.
Okay. Thank you very much for the talk. I'm very happy to see that the European Union finally takes seriously the solid system. Before the case was not like that. But they still have a doubt. Many of the processes that take place in a soil, especially the recovery, the restoration, the rehabilitation, take no years, take decades, even centuries. And all our programs are for 3-4 years maximum. Do you have any idea how you are going to face when all these living labs, after 4 years of funding, will go no funding? Because I have my own experience that some experiments for 20 years were abandoned. Then when you abandon not only this year, you abandon all experiments. And this is because of lack of funding. In my case, it's in Spain. Probably in other cases, it's in other countries. So we don't have a program for living labs, research stations that will last for centuries, which is should be the objective. Not only for science, also for management, so equality.
Shall I reply directly? Yeah. So you're addressing a super relevant issue. And there's the sustainability of any kind of infrastructure that we build through the framework programs. So first of all, just to start, you don't need to stick to 3 to 4 years. We have many projects that last 5 years, so that's already a start. Now, as to the sustainability of living labs, for example, we are, what I was mentioning, how to tap into other fundings, other tools. This is exactly that, to see how we can capitalize on the network of living labs beyond the time of the funding and even beyond the time of the mission. So we have this idea to have the last call of living labs in 27, so that by 2030 we have 100. In this period, it's when we are going to develop also the next Common Agricultural Policy, the next CAP. I was mentioning that we are in touch with the member states on the strategic plans. In the CAP, you have the opportunity to fund so-called operational groups that are sort of small research initiatives between farmers, researchers. So exactly like a mini living lab, a bit different. So we have some funds put to try and promote this. And of course, the obvious question will be, will we manage in the next years to introduce in the CAP, for example, a better, a more, I would say, a wider way to fund these operational groups in a way that they can sustain living labs in the next CAP. So this would be one option, but that is to be developed, to be seen, discussed with member states. And then we are also in discussions with our colleagues from DG Regions that manage the regional funds. There are also several options, but which you could at least improve the possibilities for sustaining established infrastructures, also research infrastructures. So that's not super satisfactory at the moment, but we are working on this to sustain what we just built in the mission. It would be really a pity if after, as you say, 5-6 years, these living labs have to stop and don't have any further impact.
Yes, I also have a question, also very much related to the living lab and the current call. You currently have a FPA call on living labs, trying to support the development of the living labs. My question is very much related to the timing of the next call, because you have now a call open supposedly to develop or to support the development of living labs, and then already next year, 23, I don't know exactly with time, you have to call for the Living Lab. So
Yeah.
what type of support do you give to the, well, the projects in development to already link to other projects that are maybe not existing yet or are in development, are on the development? I think the planning of some of the objectives of one project is pretty tight.
Yeah.
In the whole planning. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, I can just say that, yes, we're going to start at the same time. The first Living Labs, 4 Living Labs actually. Sorry, not fully. 4 projects of Living Labs, so in total about 20. We're starting them at the same time as support structure. So there will be, of course, the beginning, a bit of a developmental phase where the Living Labs don't have straight away a support. But I think it will come quite quickly, that the support structure can provide advice, can network, so this will come quite quickly. And I think there's no other way to do it if we don't want to lose time. The mission is going to be evaluated next year, the first interim evaluation. It's in the legal basis, it's foreseen. And so we cannot really build slowly. You know, time is really quite, the plan is very ambitious, and 27, the last call, is almost around the corner. So we're going to start this both together, and I'm quite confident that it will work quite nicely. Yeah. But we've seen, so when we go to meetings to explain the concept of Living Labs, we thought it's quite telling and people know about. And when you get to nitty-gritty details, it's more complicated, and people really start scratching their heads. And yeah, so what I think is that we will have in the first call a very heterogeneous type of projects. And so by the next calls, then with the help of the established service, I think we can get more harmonized approaches and more streamlined ways of doing things. So the first call will be an experiment, and let's see what comes up. Yeah. Yes, we as well. So I don't know if there, I take over now Saskia's moderator role. I don't know if there, if there are any more questions. Okay.
I'll just ask the question. Okay. Imagine Living Labs to be showing the benchmark of front or either of them on the front runner, or is it transition?
Not fully sure I understand. So a lighthouse should be really like what you call a front runner. So this is the solutions, like you have in some of your lighthouse farms in bargaining. These are here fantastic solutions, farmers performing well. This is a lighthouse. Now, a Living Lab, as I say, if you think about it, it's a cluster of about 10 farms working together on a specific problem. It's not about being a front runner. It's really about having in a certain region a similar theme. For example, in the Netherlands, maybe it's a nitrogen issue, could be, or a water issue. So how can you work together in that kind of setting with different, of course, in each farm, different situations, but still the theme is almost the same. Or how can you work together with researchers, finding solutions and testing them? Each farm will have a different management approach. So this is a fantastic place where we try and link a generic finding research and applying this to specific different contexts. You know, we always know that we have the interaction between the farm, the farmer, the management, the environment. This is all something that we need to address when we get into innovations. It's not enough to have innovation, we need to know how to apply it. What I think is also very nice in Living Labs is that you need to have the socioeconomic approach, or social sciences approach, to adapt to test any innovation in various settings. So anyway, we're squeezing researchers to work together with the practitioners and to get his methods from social sciences. So it's not about front running; it's about doing things. And
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Now we'll continue with our second keynote speaker, who is Willem Ferwerda. He is the CEO and the founder of an organization called Common Land. And he will tell us all about it. Please have the floor. Yes.
Hear me well? So thank you for the invitation, for being here. It was wonderful to hear also the presentation of Annette Schneegans, also on the lighthouses. Thank you very much. Because I might follow up a little bit on your presentation. So that was a very good introduction on the EU policies and on the soil policies. So thank you very much. Yeah, I'm leading Common Land, which is an organization founded by IUCN, Commission on Ecosystem Management, and a business school and investors. And we are now working for 10 years, more or less, on creating a language for landscape restoration, and also doing it by practicing it. Let me explain a little bit about where we are now, our experiences over the last 9 to 10 years, and how come that we are here and what we are facing. I will end my presentation with some learnings and with some recommendations, and hope that you have a lot of questions. So also the previous speaker has been talking about the complexity of soil. But if you expand it a little bit, you will find the complexity of an ecosystem or a landscape, as you could say, is super. It has many dimensions. In a lot of reports, you can read about those dimensions. This picture was taken out of the Global Land Outlook that came out just recently, the second version. And it shows how security, agriculture, space, ecosystems, climate, biodiversity, it is all connected to it, and water, of course, and soil, all connected to that landscape. So how to make sure, how to deal with this issue if you really want to restore landscapes or want to create measurements for integrated landscape or integrated landscape management issues, how to do this on the ground and how to create scale, or what are the conditions to create scale. That was my quest when I left IUCN 10 years ago. I was leading IUCN Netherlands as a director for 12 years. And I realized that, yeah, conservation is maybe the most important thing to face the planetary boundaries. You could say conservation is number one, protect. The second one is connect protected areas. And the third one is regenerate or restore those places that are suffering from exploitation, whether that is agriculture, unsustainable agriculture, or mining, or whatever. So land. And I'm sure you are aware of the direct and indirect drivers of landscape degradation, but let's briefly look into those. You have the indirect drivers, you know, probably population growth, migration, the markets, the whole way of dealing with landscapes. Governments and institutions that are quite often still, you know, using perversive subsidies or perversive policies. And you have the direct drivers, and the most familiar ones are urbanization, infrastructure, and agriculture. But if you want to work on those things, it's also very good to look into the past. And one thing that always inspired me a lot was the ecosystem approach that was adopted by the COP5 of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity in 2000. And the ecosystem approach is, you could say, a theoretical approach. But listen what it says. It is a strategy for integrated management of land, water, and living resources that promotes conservation and sustainable use in an equitable way. It is based on the application of appropriate scientific methodologies focused on levels of biological organizations, which encompasses the essential processes functions and interactions among organisms and their environment. It recognizes that humans, with their cultural diversity, are an integral component of ecosystems. So this ecosystem approach, and you can still find that beautiful booklet on the web, I think it was 2004 that it came out, or yeah. And this ecosystem approach always inspired me, but it always, triggered some questions how to do this. This is theory. This is the dream, you could say, but how to make this practical? And after being working in the context of conservation for so many years, supporting projects on the ground for many, many years with indigenous people, with farmers, with conservation NGOs like WWF and Conservation International, the Nature Conservancy, and a lot of local, I realized that what is still difficult is to find a language that is bridging place and practitioners, farmers, conservationists, local entrepreneurs, and the institutions as finance, European Union, governments, World Bank, Global Environmental Facility, all those finance institutes, but especially also the pension funds, shareholders, the big finance industry that you can find in New York, in London. And if you dig down into the language issue, basically everything is about two things: risks and returns, or values. What is a risk? What is a return? And if you look into risk and return, you run into another topic, and I think it was just mentioned, that it's time. Someone above asked that question about projects versus process. Time. I come from the world where we need to work with 4 years projects, maybe a 5 years project. We all know the reality asks us for 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 years timelines. So how to connect those things and how to make that work? And how to create a language that is practical, that even these boys in Egypt, where I was just last Sunday, understand. And is still based on science. That was the quest. So let me explain a bit about that quest and how we work to look into that. First, we brought down what degradation really is. And degradation is caused by maximizing return on investment per hectare. Let it think in. Maximizing return on investment. That is what most people are taught at business schools. If you add 2 words per hectare, you get degradation, deforestation, pollution, and all the other things. So we brought down degradation into a different narrative. Maximizing return on investment per hectare. And people understand that in the institutional and finance world, maximizing return on investment per hectare. But so how to look into that from a landscape perspective? If you think about risks and returns, you also need to look into losses. And if you examine a degraded landscape, and as a tropical ecologist, I must say I have seen a lot of degraded landscapes in my work in the tropics. But if you really carefully look at it and you do interviews with farmers and with indigenous people in those landscapes, you will basically see that they are talking about 4 losses. Loss of purpose and hope and pride. People are leaving those areas. They are abandoned. They leave those places. A loss of employment and social and environmental security. Of course, a loss of biodiversity and water and all these things, and soil erosion. That is clear. At the end, especially in the long term, a loss of economic activity. Degraded areas are places where people don't want to live anymore, and people migrate to cities, and that is what's happening. So we use those 4 losses to change a language of degradation into a language of, you could say, restoration. And we change the narrative from, if you have a degraded landscape that is caused by maximizing return on investment per hectare, we need to a restored landscape that is producing 4 returns per landscape. That is actually what we did, and we tested this narrative in many places. And those returns are the return of hope and inspiration. That is the critical first step if you want to create lighthouses in the European Union with soil and landscape. You need to start with talking to those people living in those landscapes and provide them with hope, return of inspiration. That is just 1/4 of the return framework. The second one is social returns. We need to talk about jobs. We need to talk about bringing back jobs in landscapes. We need to talk about purpose jobs, jobs with a purpose in those landscapes that are associated and connected to landscapes and to the ecology of those landscapes, but also to the culture. Natural returns, we'll come back to that later. That is of course about bringing back the biodiversity in landscapes, create sustainable agriculture, and incentivize those agroforestry systems, and create companies that deliver sufficient financial returns. Actually, those companies should work with those landscapes initiatives instead of against it. So this is the base of the practical, of the framework. 4 returns, a landscape should deliver 4 returns. But if you look into how are you doing that, you need to look to the landscape. You need to look what a landscape is. And a landscape is, yeah, you could say it's a combination of different ecosystems and land use practices. But here again, you should try to capture a landscape in such a way that even people who live in those landscapes, who understand what the essence is of agriculture or forestry or water or soil, that they can have that you give them the ability to zoom out and think in zones, because a landscape is a big thing. We use a definition that we only want to work in a landscape which is bigger than 100,000 hectares, because smaller landscapes will not work. If you start to work at farm level, you will not be able to address the ecology of a landscape. I've seen working in the Amazon when we were able to finance the conservation of 1,000 hectares of rainforest in Brazil, while around that 1,000 hectares, the government decided to create a plantation of soy of 100,000 hectares. So at that stage, it doesn't matter anymore if that 1,000 hectares is protected or not. And if you put a lot of money into that 1,000 hectares, while the soy plantation with all those chemicals is coming along, it doesn't make sense. So we need to be able to think big and think in ecosystems. So how to, let's say, kickstart the ecological foundation of a landscape? That means that you need to understand what a landscape is. And we said a landscape should consist of basically 3 zones. You have an economic zone where you produce, where you have infrastructure, where people live, like in cities. You have, of course, protected areas, or the European network of protected areas, Natura 2000. But in between, you have agriculture. And that agriculture should move into what we call a combined zone, a place where you combine biodiversity with production. And if you start talking with farmers and people in those landscapes and bring this zoning there, they start to understand what the landscape is. And they are able to translate that into a vision, into how that landscape should look like within 20, 30, 40 years. So this helps tremendously to bring the dream of a sustainable landscape into practice. The next step is, and I mean, what we've seen is that a lot of farmers are already doing this at a smaller scale. For instance, in Tamil Nadu here in India, they used a 3-zone approach. But the next step is time. And time means that you need to think long term. By the way, this presentation will be shared with you. So you will see why this powerful language of zoning is really so important. And yes, it brings all the analytics into the landscape, because you can use with this zoning approach the data that is accumulated by science. But the next thing is time. And here you have an overview of the 4 returns framework for landscape restoration. And time, you see here, it's critical that we talk of a period of minimum 20 years. Minimum 20 years is still understandable by some pension funds. Some governmental agencies increasingly do understand this, but we all know that time is not sufficient. 20 years is not sufficient to implement large-scale integrated landscape management processes. But still, 20 years is the critical, you could say, minimum period of doing these things. So 4 returns are delivered by 3 zones in a minimum time frame of 20 years. Okay, that's the theory. So we developed this in 2012 with IUCN and the Commission on Ecosystem Management, that commission of scientists that laid the basis of the ecosystem approach in 2000 at COP5 of the CBD. And we started doing it, build up a team and looked into how are you going to make this happen? And we brought together a lot of multidisciplinary experts on, who have been working with partnership approaches, with stakeholder management sessions, ecologists, agricultural scientists, soil scientists, etc. And we realized that basically you need to look into a 5-process step to make this happen at a landscape scale. You need to bring people together and establish a kind of a landscape entity, a landscape partnership. You need to create with those farmers and conservationists a shared understanding, a common understanding, or a vision for that landscape, and therefore the zoning really helps. Together with them, you write down the first pinpoints or the first elements of a landscape plan. How are you going to realize it in those zones? What do you need to do? Talking about policy, making it happen, regenerative agriculture, all these things. You start doing it, basically, and you develop a monitoring and learning system based on those 4 returns. So let me show you a bit about these things. Yes, there are. You have a whole set of KPIs, key performance indicators, behind those 4 returns of impact, and we can share with you that later. You can find it on the web. It is about you probably know that the return of natural capital is pretty easy, still very difficult, but pretty easy to monitor and measure compared to the return of inspiration, which is maybe the most important and also the most difficult one. But gradually by learning, by doing, we were able to do this. The return of financial capital, that is about productivity, but it's also about carbon. It's about products, about tourism, it's about water, but it's also about risks. And risks are an element that most investors don't understand if they talk about biodiversity and restoration. So there we still have to do a lot of work to convince those partners, those potential partners, and to bring them on board. We have set up a whole monitoring and evaluation system, which you can also find on the web. And that monitoring and evaluation system is done by those landscape partners in the field. So it is, and we have some independent people helping this. But the fact is, if we bring in a lot of independent consultants to do this, it will be impossible actually to finance it. So let me explain a bit about building a proof of concept with others in the field. In 2013, we set up Common Land as an entity to make this possible. So we have a group of experts working in different countries now to make this happen, and we increasingly partner with a lot of organizations that are shown here. Some criteria for success, if you look into a landscape approach, is that you need to understand the eco-restoration potential. You work in countries where there's a kind of where there's a kind of political stability that will help, of course. I've been talking about the size, 100,000 hectares minimum. There should be a business case potential. Think about regenerative agriculture or agroforestry of these or other potentials, business cases that are quite often already developed, but only a little bit. So we need to enable these sustainable business cases to grow. You need to have local leadership, and that local leadership can lead or can create landscape partnerships. It would be great if governments, and especially local governments, will buy in. That is not always easy, because by doing this, you can sometimes run into, still the you could say the old style policies. And it is important that you can find funders who can cover long-term process costs. Yeah, and that's a tricky one. I will come back to that in a second. So let's look into those 5 process elements first. Those 5 process elements, as I said, are critical to implement this. And you start with, let's say, identify a landscape. And as soon as you've been looking, I've identified a landscape, and you start to talk with local NGOs, farmer associations, and local governments, you feel and know soon that you can establish a landscape partnership. And that that people are ready to create a common shared understanding of a vision what that landscape should be in the future. And we have realized that using those 4 returns and the zoning, that this really helps to facilitates and accelerates this process of co-creation. By doing co-creation, you make use of a tool, and that tool is called the Theory U. Maybe you've heard of it, but the Theory U is developed by the Processing Institute at MIT some 15 years ago, Otto Scharmer. And we work closely with the Processing Institute, and we work with experts who can help us, who facilitate those co-creation processes with local stakeholders in a landscape. And the Theory U is basically a tool that starts with listening. It's called the co-initiation phase. And then it starts with sensing. So what are the things that what are the things that are happening in this area with all those stakeholders, with the landscape, and step by step, you move into a process where you start to co-create together a new future. You envision a new future, and make that possible with the map. So you have maps on the ground, making that possible by looking into what should change on the map in this area, using the zoning approach, the 3 zones. So people really start to read the landscape on the map and envision how that landscape should look like in 20 or 30 years. And then you start basically doing this. So we make use of this process, which is a very intense but very deep process. It will go to the purpose of people in those areas to make it happen. So since 2013, we started in a few landscapes in South Africa, in an area, the water catchment of Port Elizabeth of 500,000 hectares. In Spain, 1 million hectare area between Murcia and Granada, it's called the Altiplano, very dry area. I will share some photos. In the Netherlands, in Germany, in India, and Australia. And meanwhile, we are working in more areas, but not as an implementer, but we guide other organizations to do this. So here you see some pictures of Spain. You see in the middle, you see the Theory U process, which was done in a workshop for a couple of days with local farmers and conservationists in 2014. If you can read Spanish, you can see Año 2034. So that was, they were envisioning how that landscape should look like in the future. And of course, at the end, the farmers said, we want to regreen our landscape in such a way that we can have a local economy that is strong enough to bring our kids back and our grandchildren back, because that was the biggest and the most important motivation. They wanted to have the schools reopen again, and which was a very deep and powerful wish. And by doing that, they needed to have more and new business models that were much more sustainable, with local production in those landscapes, building soils, looking to aquifers, looking into biodiversity in protected areas. And all these things came together through this U process and the zoning and the 4 returns setting, that framework. So at this moment, we have a landscape partnership in that 1 million hectare area. It's a population of 200,000 people. We work on restoring the natural environment. We work together with that partnership on creating business cases for regenerative almonds, pistachios, and cereals and olives. And increasingly, we now have more than 450 farmers that are members of this association Alvilal. You can see that it is a huge area, and step by step, we in a way we frame the whole work of the local partner association by identifying what should be done to bring back those 4 returns. But that is already now reflecting in the landscape, because many of those farmers are working together to restore that landscape and make sure that the water is soaked in the soil instead of eroded down. So you have swale production, you have compost production, green cover. They stop tilling. All these things are happening now, while they also are increasingly talking to the protected area managers of the 3 large national parks that are in that area. Here you have a zoom in of that area with the 3 zones. So the largest area is a protected area of almost 600,000 hectares by 3 large national parks, but they are understaffed. They are threatened by fires. There is unsustainable tourism going on. People with barbecues moving in, which is of course a huge problem. So they had before, they were never talking to the farmer community. They now have they are part of this whole network, so they talk to the farmer community. The farmers community understand the importance of the protected area, and step by step we were able to also bring in funding and also help to restore areas within the protected areas and create corridors over the public land with farmers to make corridors between the protected areas. We're still working on that. In the combined zone, we have set up 4 companies now on regenerative agriculture. Most of the farmers, of course, are now living there. We still need to go a long way to restore or to let's say to move from intensified non-sustainable agriculture to regenerative organic agriculture. But that's a path we need to go. And the economic zone, which was almost non-existing, some small villages and cities, we were able to, with those landscape partners, to set up some companies in those areas, and they have identified the places, those cities, where they want to do the processing of the almonds, the pistachios, and the olives, etc. Yeah. We are also visualizing the goals with all kinds of tools to make sure that the farmers and those people in those landscapes are up to speed and make sure that they have a way to look forward to and to work on. We do that on maps, of course. This is just a visualization of those maps to give you an indication how the natural zone should continue, how the agriculture combined should develop, and as well as the economic zone. And yeah, it's also important that you can put all those developments in one sheet. And that's what we did here. You see the production and the companies that we've set up in olives and almonds. You see the place, you see how you can monitor high over the different the process elements as well as the impact of the 4 returns. And you see the zoning in one map. And that is important for investors to make sure that you can, let's say, bring the whole complexity of one landscape in one sheet and explain it to investors. This is so that is by bridging the narrative, bridging the gap between, let's say, the non-place organizations and the place organization people, which is quite tough, of course, but this is the way to do it. Some impressions of people working in the field. You see green cover agriculture, almonds, swale making with tractors, mapping exercises, companies. You also see an inspiration project the farmers did themselves there, of a figure, a shaman from a cave, that they said this shaman is important for us. We wanted to highlight this shaman, which is in a cave somewhere in the mountains, and but we wanted to put it in a 16 hectares near the highway with aromatics to show that we also building an aromatic oil industry here. You see the soil building, the soil in here, which you see here. It took 10 years to build that soil in this place near Guadix. Almost no rain, so no tilling, basically, and green manure. That was the way to work on these kind of things. And you see the mosaic landscapes of this place. So yeah, work in progress, not easy, and it costs money. I will come back to that in a second. This, by the way, you see almonds with green cover and without green cover. And you see some holm oak trees. They're standing alone in the landscape, as that part was, of course, covered with holm oak trees. And we are still planting holm oak trees. And a machine digging swales in that landscape to make sure that the water will be retained. In South Africa, we are doing similar things. We also set up a landscape partnership of with farmers and conservation organizations there. And we are changing the narrative of unsustainable goat keeping into rotational aromatic plantations, also making swales and restoring the natural zone with spec-bone planting, which you can see here on the right. And one of the products is honey bush tea, which you can see in the middle. Yeah, and still a lot of things going under that is happening. In Australia, just to give you some flavor of another project where we work, it's a huge area in West Australia, the wheat belt of Australia. It was a completely deforested area. The English started to deforest it at the beginning of the 19th century. We brought together 5 parties, Aboriginal companies and Aboriginal NGO, the University of West Australia, and 3 NGOs and farmers associations. And we also started a regenerative ag company in 2014, which became listed at the Australian Stock Exchange in 2019. And they produce regenerative oat milk, regenerative lupine, and meat. And here you see some impressions of what is going on there. So yes, coming back to the funding, because I can imagine that you will have a lot of questions about the funding. And this is an overview on how the funding is, on how we have experienced per landscape what the funding is. So what we have experienced, this is the case of Spain, is that if we really work well in that 1 million hectare, we might have a potential 1 billion investment needed to make this happen. And that 1 billion comes from blended finance. A large part will come from investors. Another part needs to come from subsidies from through the European Green Deal or local governments and charities. But the essential part is the yellow line, and that is the part no one wants to pay. We have estimated that it costs us between €500,000 and €1 million per year to maintain what we call the forage engine in this landscape. That is paying salaries of local staff, doing courses, doing small pilots, incentivize farmers to do different, etc., etc., etc. But we don't want to have this funding coming from project money every 2 or 3 or 4 years. Because what we do here is we build trust and we build experiences and we stay in the landscape and we make the promise of the return of inspiration. We make it happen. So far, we were able to attract philanthropists to pay, let's say, to guarantee €500,000 per year for 20 years. And we are able to do this in those 4 landscapes I just show you. I just have shown you because we also work in the Netherlands. But governments don't do this. They don't give you upfront €10 million for 20 years to do the process cost. And that is exactly what's lacking. If you want to make system change, this type of money is needed. And if we only rely on philanthropy, it is too difficult. So we would argue, we would need, and that the same case is happening now with the Netherlands, if we don't have long-term commitment for landscape approaches, to cover the process cost for landscape approaches, we will have a lot of farmers being on our highway for the coming months, I can tell you. So that is what is needed. At the same time, we bring in, by having that yellow line done, we can bring in carbon funding, grants funding, and subsidies for all kinds of projects within that landscape, and build companies that will take some years that can, at a certain moment, receive loans and investments. And at the end, of course, the target is that policies will change towards pro-landscape policies, and taxation systems will enable this instead of working against it, which is still the case. So what we do to make this happen is that we make, of all those landscapes, we make landscape plans, where in a very structured way, with a good analysis, we show the roadmap on realizing this for the coming years, using the 4 returns, 3 zones, 20 years, and the 5 process elements, and in a very consistent way, so that people can compare those landscapes, and especially investors can compare those landscapes and step into this. And now, after almost 9 years, we see that something is happening. We are working with labs in Europe. We have opened up a landscape lab with more than 10 partners now in Europe. in Sweden, you can see it, Estonia, Ireland, UK, Romania, Portugal, etc. But there are more organizations coming to us who want to work with the same framework. And that is exactly the goal of what we wanted to do. We wanted to have that narrative and that framework being, let's say, the tool for integrated landscape management. And if everyone is going to use the same tool, while we know that the landscape, that the nitty-gritty details are very different for each landscape, but have this overall tool and narrative and language ready, we are able to build a new landscape asset class. And that is actually the goal of what Common Land is trying to establish. Because the momentum for policy for integrated landscape management and restoration is now. But it will only happen if we as NGOs and policymakers agree on a framework that people understand. I think that is my last slide. Thank you very much. With some learnings.
Very inspirational talk. Thank you so much. I would like to ask also Annette to come here, and then we have a discussion with the and me and the audience, and also the online audience. We were planning to do a Mentimeter, but because we are a little bit out of time, we're going to not do that, because otherwise we don't have time to have you together reflect on your talks, and I will try to take that a little bit. So yeah, my question would be to you, Annette, and I will give you this later, because otherwise the people online cannot hear. The Soil Deal for Europe has as a main objective to prevent land degradation and restore degraded land. So how does the socioeconomic aspect is integrated in that to ensure this envisioned implementation plan, and how do the Living Lab concept fit into that, especially thinking about what Willem just told us.
Yeah. No, so I think that what you just mentioned, so the Living Labs in a way are the tools that allow to bring socioeconomic research closer to, say, the more natural sciences research, and that helps to bridge this, what's also called sometimes the knowledge practice divide. So I was saying in my talk, we know already a lot, even if you find out solutions. You've seen from the examples that any solution, whether it's a technology or let's say basic understanding of something, needs still to be adapted to the local conditions. No place will be the same, neither in physical terms, nor in the social fabric, nor in the, let's say, environment, or it's the inspiration. So people are just different. So they would use the solutions in different ways. And this is where the Living Labs, I think, are very powerful mechanisms. We still have to test them at that scale. So it's new, and I cannot speak about this experience. But the existing examples from Canada in particular, from which we've taken inspiration, show us that these are the places where, let's say, in one setting, you really get together various partners that work in different ways, and where you can think about the specificities of a setting to create adaptive solutions. So this would be a short way.
Yes, but in which way do you think that the approach of Common Land, because in my opinion, when I look at it from not being part of Common Land and only just being introduced to the Living Lab as they are sort of in the European Commission, how would then, because in my opinion, the approach of Common Land would be perfect for a Living Lab. So, this could be also an example. Could you reflect on that?
No, I was thinking actually we would have to talk later.
We can.
Yes, in more detail. It was very, very inspiring. What I was trying to note is the following. The Common Land approach is, of course, in the spatial context much bigger. So we're talking Living Labs of the region. So it would not be 100,000 hectares, I guess, in the Netherlands, no? Could be less, or Belgium or Luxembourg. So the scale is much smaller, and I think the ambition is also more restricted to a certain land use. If you have Living Labs in forests, you will not have the 3 zones. So it's different. But what we can take inspiration is, of course, the whole process you were mentioning, what your seed funding is. You have a seed funding for just creating the process, bringing people on board, creating the shared vision, and then monitoring how you move towards that shared vision. This is something that we should really think about for a certain living lab, not just having a work plan and a certain research question, how do we tackle nitrogen surplus, but then can we embed into living labs this kind of moderation exercise? I think that would be kind of idea.
Yes.
It's interesting. Sorry. So what we've learned is that, and I didn't share, by the way, an example from the Netherlands, because we started working in the Netherlands in 2016 in an area around Amsterdam, peat meadow system, 125,000 hectares, including Amsterdam. We set up a foundation like in Spain, a landscape partnership. It's called Weiland, which is a funny name because it means wij with a short, with a lange, we land, actually. If you translate it, but Weiland also means meadow, peat meadow. So we set it up in that 125,000 hectares. And what we started is starting to talk with farmers, number one, and with local, the water boards and so on. Only talking, only listening to, and step by step, we identified their problems and their challenges. And of course, there were similar challenges as we faced in Spain, only more with water and so on. But what happened is when we started to identify the challenges and brought them together in courses and in meetings, and of course that costs money because you need to have a team to make it happen. We were building trust. While building trust, we also were identifying the real issues, and the real issues was, of course, soil. It was water retention or water level, the carbon issue, people moving in, trying to, or especially city councils, to get more land for building houses. All these things are there. But we also were able to identify a common denominator in how should that landscape look like in the future. And we had a very different discussions. We are now underway with Weiland since 2019. It is a separate NGO because we started it as a project from Commonland. Now but we make them independent, and so they can work with that framework in their own way. And what happened in this process is that at a certain moment, other places in the Netherlands came to Weiland and to us and said, we want to have a similar process in place. We have an area of 250,000 hectares, 100,000 hectares here, the Sallandse Heuvelrug, the Drunense Duinen in Brabant. So all those entities came to us and we said, yeah, we cannot handle that. So we started a lab process, a living lab process, you could say, by bringing the leaders of those regions together in a place that we called For Tomorrow's Harvest, for the oogst van morgen. You can Google it. And we did it with the Dutch government, with an entity that is working between the Ministry of Agriculture and the Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management. The overlegorgaan fysieke leefomgeving, for those people who speak Dutch. And there was a more requests for these kinds of approaches coming on. So we had meetings, 3 days meetings in nice places, doing the U process in a very physical way. With, we have a whole instrumentarium on this. And what we've seen is that the need for these processes are so big, an area-based approach, and a long-term process on this, and that people can solve issues themselves without polarization, because it brings people together in a landscape. They're all attached to that landscape. They want something beautiful. They want to beautify it. That is their aim. But we were not able to fund it. Why? Governments didn't want it. They couldn't do it because their framework, 4 years, 3 years. And that is our dilemma here. So we want governments and finance institutes to come on board and say, let's test it for 20 years, not for 3 years. Let's give some small grants. 500,000 for a year for a landscape of 1 million hectares is really small to cover the process cost. But then not to say, no, we need to monitor you every 1 or 2 years. No, say we do it together. Here's 20 years grant. Every 5 years we do a mile, we have a check, and we move further. The risks are very low because yes, if you see what a lot of those projects fail, as we all know. I've been on the other side of spending money with projects with IUCN from development aid. A lot of those projects fail because the funder, the donor, whether it's a philanthropist or a government, is putting too many criteria and too many expectations in a very limited time frame on all those implementers. And that is my thing here. So I think we would really can partner, and it would be great. But the other thing is, give us the testing space and some limited funding to make this happen in, let's say, 10 European landscapes, 10 million per landscape for 20 years. Deal or no deal?
I really need to react to this. I don't want to bother you with administrative.
No, I know it. I know
it's so non-inspiring. You come up with this big vision of 20 years, and then you have an administrator who says.
I know.
So, but.
And we have the same thing with philanthropists. It's not only the European Union. Don't worry. The foundations follow the same process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, but still, I think that. So, I was going to ask you. So, if Commonland was funding exactly this seed funding of $500,000 per year, because it would be really needed. Now, on the 20 years, and this is something maybe for any other plans you have with Living Labs and beyond, for the Spanish colleague about this, I think it's good to have that kind of, to acknowledge and really push forward to decision makers, explaining why we need this long-term approach. But on the realistic side, you will not get there in the next, in my lifetime, certainly not. We have, just to give you an example, for the Common Agricultural Policy, for the research program, for any European budget, we have 7 years. We have 7 years budgets. In national terms, it's sometimes only 4 to 5 years, it all depends. But I think asking for something that is just not there now,
we know
will
that,
really frustrate you maybe. So what I would really suggest is to have a 20 years perspective, but chopping that down to the real framing, which only 7 years is a lot.
Yeah.
And then really hope that it's an ongoing exercise that, through success, replicates itself. This would be really my big suggestion. And then we could get it down to a more practical level where we really can see, to financial engineer, realistically, which kind of instruments can we use?
Yeah, no, and just for information, we are now working on the EU policy document that we will present later this year at COP27 on the need for these kind of frameworks and recommendations. So we do that with IUCN, WWF, World Resources, TNC, all those usual suspects. So we're working on it now. We just had a workshop in Brussels on this. So it is part of the lobby and the policy and the advocacy. I'm aware of that. And it's not only that, it's not only European Union or the governments. The biggest task we have actually is with the finance industry. Because on the one hand, we need to transition, let's say, practitioners to think about how to ecologize, let's say, land use, and on the land. And on the other hand, we need to transition or transform the finance industry to move away from only maximizing return on investment in a short time frame, and consider the risk of biodiversity loss into their system. And that is a major topic. So.
Indeed. Well, we can just take one more question from the room. Oh, there is a lot of questions from the room. Okay, well, let's start with Manuel. I'm coming to you.
Hello, I'm Manuel Seger from Trier University in Germany. And one of the points I've been missing of both presentations, even I think it's implicit, is the people involved in all these things. They need and they want to make a living of their production. And for some of these points, I think one of the points that needs to be changed very much is how to market their products. Because in the actual points, I know the Olla de Baza quite well, So they're selling their tomatoes partially to Germany, and then they have big problems also with the buyers. Or we are working now with wine production in the Mosel area, and they're all individual marketers, not all, but that's how they make a living. And I think we should always target also how to make them possible make a living of their product, because one of the things they don't like, as I have seen, is to deal permanently with all the fundings and supports and whatever. They want to do their work, they love their landscape, and they would want to make a living of that. And how do you incorporate this and then convince also, and that was one of the most astonishing things, how do you get a majority of producers and of people of 1 million hectares in the other Yadebasa to participate?
Shall I start to answer? It's that you ask a whole new presentation. That's basically what you ask for, but you're so right. Access to market is super difficult. We now experience with the Australian case how we exit to market through a listed company. So there we have chosen to do the communication not through an NGO but through a listed company in regenerative products. And what they do actually is they market the projects. They have principles on regenerative ag on the one side with farmers, and they have access to their producers, and they are growing, and they put those products into the marketplace online and with a lot of lobby, etc. And they now have signed agreements with large supermarkets in Australia, but also in Singapore and increasingly also to China. So that is a kind of access to market. That's an example that we're now testing, and it is working so far quite well. Interesting is that most of the farmers are the shareholders of that company. So that is the farmers who want to move towards regenerative, because they know that they cannot continue living in the chemical farm industry that they have done before. It's because that place was a Monsanto country. So in the Spanish case, it's tough because this has to do with culture. And what we experienced with the several regenerative agriculture companies we set up in Spain is that each company and group of farmers want to have their own identity and their own this and their own that. And that is because they think from a producing point of view, and they're not thinking from a consumer point of view. So what we now do is that we work with them and try to bring in a real strong marketeer, because that's what we need there. We need to bring this to the markets, and we need to make it, you could say, sexy, and especially also think in larger areas. That means the price can go down. A last remark on this topic is this is not only about markets, and because we all know that we pay too little for our food. So yeah, the consumer is to blame, but who's the consumer? That is, it's a tough topic. But there's another thing, and that is carbon. We haven't addressed carbon here, but what we see is that carbon, agriculture carbon and natural carbon for natural areas will incentivize, will give the farmers a better price. But of course, every country has its own carbon system, and in Europe it's quite complicated and it's costly. So we have set up a carbon team, and we work now in Africa to test it with other organizations to work on carbon. I just came back from SECAM in Egypt, where they also started with carbon for farmers and so on. But this is, we see that as an acceleration to give farmers a better price, because they should be paid not only, and you mentioned it as well, they should not be paid for the products alone, payments for ecosystem services, that is payments for soil building. And then the only strategy we now have is carbon. There's not something, there's no biodiversity, there are no biodiversity credits, there are almost no water credits. So carbon is the only way at this moment that we can look into. But if there are more accepted, and still in the voluntary market. So that is a brief answer to my question.
Okay,
to your question.
Thank you very much. We need to move on now to the next. I want to thank you very much for being here. 1 second, I'm going to give you a little gift from the Netherlands. This is an organic bulb, a tulip bulb. Thank you. And then we also have